what we've tried to do on this panel is really to assess the progress of the energy transition. And to do that, we've invited a number of people who have worked together worked very hard over the past couple years to make this a reality. So Barbara Berger, Vice President of Innovation and President of Shell Technology Ventures, is joining us. Lara Cottingham, Chief Sustainability Officer at the University of Houston. Chris George, President and Executive Director of Evolve Houston. You've heard a little bit about Evolve, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. My friend and colleague, Bob Harvey, President and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership. And finally, Emily Reichert, CEO of Greentown Labs. So I think we have a relatively short panel here, but I think we'll have a quite an interesting discussion. And I think if you haven't turned your camera on, or Emily, it looks like you may not have yet. If you can or are having problems, there you go. So let's just get started. I guess, you guys know each other pretty well. You've been working together a year. So what I'm hoping we can do is, in this panel, is have more of a chat really around what we've been doing over the past couple of years and think about how we want to position Houston for the future. And so I'll just tee up the question. Energy innovation, as I mentioned at the start of the discussion this morning, is really the challenge that's going to make this transition work. And so can you guys talk about, from each of your perspectives, what progress Houston has made and where do you see it going forward? And maybe, Bob, just to break the ice here, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you give a few comments, and then I'll see who else wants to break into the discussion.
Well, thank you, Brett, and thanks for the question. It's really quite remarkable how rapidly Houston has evolved around this issue of the energy transition, in my view. For 100 years, we were considered the oil and gas capital of the world. We started calling ourselves the energy capital of the world. But it's only been in the last few years that we've really talked explicitly and collectively around this issue of an energy transition. Almost 3 years ago to the day, we formed a committee at the partnership called the New Energy Roundtable. We didn't know what to call it. And we reached out to folks who are already beginning to do some interesting things in what we're now calling energy transition or energy 2.0. And we asked Kirk Coburn from Shell and John Berger with Sonova to lead those early discussions. And what we discovered was, frankly, there was more happening even 3 years ago than we knew about. So that was the first notable thought. But we also heard that they weren't getting the support and visibility in the community that they thought they should be getting. And we agreed. And so ever since then, I would say for the last 3 years, we've been on a true sprint. I'm sure around this group, we've got representatives of some of those initiatives and efforts. But today, what's remarkable is, we've identified 200 companies in Houston that we would call energy 2.0 companies: solar, wind, energy storage, other energy technology plays, clean tech. So there's already a lot happening. But with the efforts of, again, my fellow panelists, and I won't steal their thunder, the momentum has increased a lot. Now, a year ago, in January of this year, the partnership made a big splash by talking about energy transition as kind of this number one imperative for Houston. And for the partnership, I think, to say that publicly the way we did, and for Bobby Tudor, our chair with Tudor, Pickering, and Holt, to be the voice of that, really seemed to catch people's attention and enthusiasm. And so for some people, they refer back to that statement by Bobby that it's time for Houston to transition from traditional fossil fuels to meet this dual challenge of meeting energy requirements, including fossil, but doing so in a low carbon way. That seemed to be, for many people, that moment in time when Houston seemed to get its act together and collectively agree that we've got to move towards this low carbon future. And so anyway, lots been happening. I'll leave it to the other panelists to talk about some of the things they're doing, which otherwise I would allude to.
Hey, Barbara, why don't you just chime in here? You work, and I've heard you talk about this. It's kind of interesting. You talk about when you came to Houston and you were doing deals more across other places in Houston, and what the opportunities that you saw from Chevron's perspective in Houston. So can you talk a little bit about that and your role, and maybe about what you're working on now?
Sure. And maybe I heard it wrong, but I think you had me employed by Shell.
Michelle, sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll let them take care of that business. I'm a proud employee of Chevron.
Yeah.
But I've told you the story, but Tech Ventures has been around for 21 years, so we're the longest standing oil and gas corporate venture organization. We've had consistent support from Chevron, and it's all about really accessing the edge of innovation. We made a lot of investments around the globe, and I've told the story that, I got asked to move to Houston to run this organization, and I got here and I started looking at the portfolio, and I realized we had more investments from Stavanger, Norway than we did Houston, Texas, and Stavanger, Norway is fine, but what was happening in Houston, and I think that's where my own discovery started of a number of things. One is, how do you introduce change into a big company? Two is, how do the big companies and the little companies work together? And I'm, progress on that one, and we still, I think, need to work on that one, but I actually think that is one that will differentiate. And then it sort of coalesced at the same time that other people were wondering about the change to the industry, the change to where people want to work and what they want to do. And, that's when I met Bob, and we started looking at, was there something that was really standing in the way of Houston growing its innovation ecosystem? And while innovation and the energy transition are not the same thing, they are close cousins. And so, innovation is all about change. It's about new businesses and how do they work with the incumbent business. So when you think about transition, you got to involve both of them. So it's been a really interesting ride. We've gained great momentum in Houston, in both of those areas. And I think fundamentally at the root of it is no one company, no one part of the energy system, no one company, university, et cetera, can do it all on their own. It does take collaboration. And some of the things we've put in place have really helped strengthen that collaboration across parties that normally wouldn't work together.
Great. Can you just mention a couple of those things that you're working on? HX Venture, Houston Next Minute.
Sure. Yeah.
Some of those ideas.
Sure, thanks. So a number of different roundtables came together to develop a plan. And, Bob certainly sponsored one, the mayor sponsored one. And fundamentally in it, there were a couple of things that were needed to create momentum. One was getting money pointed in the right direction. Two was having the talent in the city to bring in the innovative ideas. And third was this thing called collisions, which was, how do different parties collaborate? And so there was a plan and put in place, and there was this convening body, Houston Exponential, that, convening body, or kind of just a round table where different parties could come together. And there were two hats, and each one of us wears two hats that are sitting on the board. One is our own organization's hat, and the second is a Houston hat. And I think that's really important, is what are we collectively doing to move Houston forward on its ambitions? So the money side, I think you all know the launching of a fund of funds that was Houston, had Houston at its focus, but it was taking money from Houston, investing in funds that weren't in Houston, but really activating those funds to come and take a look at the startup companies in Houston from an investment standpoint, but also to look at the limited partners and corporations here to really understand what they were looking at relative to their change agenda. And, it's a catalyst or a flywheel, and a couple of years into it, great strides with both the investment, but also getting on more coast, the other two coasts, venture funds taking a look at what's happening in Houston, which was the intention.
Cool. So one of the things that created was the opportunity to attract Greentown Labs to come to town. I know you were very involved in that, and with many discussions with Emily. And maybe Emily, you could comment on that, and maybe Barbara, you can maybe want to react to that if that works. So Emily, why don't you start off that part of the conversation? We'll see if Barbara has anything to add.
Well, thank you, Brent, and thank you for having me today. I think I'm the only one who is not probably in Houston today, sitting in Somerville, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston at Greentown Labs. But I wanted to talk and really just highlight a few points that Barbara mentioned across the progress on innovation and the innovation ecosystem in Houston. And I think that you all have been deep in the weeds of this, and you know the process, but from an outsider perspective coming in, the commitment of Houston's business and civic leaders to the transition and to building a strong innovation ecosystem is really impressive. And we've experienced that, I'd say, firsthand. We went from a very light exploration of the possibility of moving into Houston, expanding our first expansion outside of Massachusetts, to having signed a lease, having 85% of our capital for not only the incubator to be built, but also our first 3 years of operation, and a list of 100 startup companies that we are considering for membership, all within 18 months. And that could not happen without the very focused and determined and intentional set of people that are working in Houston to make this happen. And so I just have to give a shout out to all the hard work that's happened to get Greentown engaged and involved in your ecosystem. I think that when we first started having these conversations, to Barbara's point around collisions, we thought, first and foremost, maybe there was a gap to be able to support the startups in Houston more, specifically the startups that would be doing the hard technology development, the science and engineering-based technology development that we support here in the Boston area. There in Houston, there didn't really seem to be an incubator that was doing that. But I think the other big gap that we had identified, and one that I think we can really help fill once we have our physical building open, which is expected in spring 2021, will be that of a convener. And so not only do we anticipate providing the community resources and support for entrepreneurs, but also bringing that clean tech innovation ecosystem together in one place. The investors, the corporate partners, other startup support organizations, universities, and then the supportive public policy actors. I sense that is and continues to be, and we're stepping into that gap already with virtual events, something that Houston needs to really take its ecosystem to the next level. And so we at Greentown Labs are going to be very happy to be playing that role. And I think that will be something that all these different players can get engaged in and really bring together everyone working on the energy transition around a set of common goals. And I think that that's definitely something that we can offer. So we hope to really be the central hub for activity driving the energy transition forward in Houston and through Houston's efforts to the entire world.
Well, that's just fantastic. And our conference next week, as you know, is really focuses on that idea of the ecosystem, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas on how we fill some of those gaps. So that's something that we feel strongly about too. That there is this opportunity to have these synergies, and that will be hopefully an ongoing conversation as well. Well, Lara, I thought I'd talk about the city's perspective on this. You and I have been talking for many years about the climate action plan and how we get what role the city plays. And obviously, the city didn't have a climate action plan, 2 or 3 years ago. And what you've done has been amazing in trying to pull all that together. So talk a little bit about that and where you see it going.
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to be here and join with my colleagues and Emily. We can't wait till you can be here in Houston with us. That, Bob said 3 years ago that they had started kind of on their journey. I often point to 3 years ago here in Houston, Hurricane Harvey was a point where so much changed, and where definitely everything I do in my daily job changed. Around climate, that we went from climate being something that we talked about, I'm going to say discreetly, it's something that we have been working on for a very long time, to climate is now something we can't not talk about. It's in every conversation, whether we like it or not. And just this past year, I was thinking about when we were on the version of this panel last time, how the climate action plan was still being put together, and that I would give presentations and people would kind of want to know more about what we're doing. What does it mean for Houston to be talking about climate? And then flash forward to today, where you see so much collaboration on this topic. And I just think that we all need to take a moment and really appreciate what happened, and that I know I didn't fully appreciate what it means on a local, on a national, and a global scale for Houston to really step up, and that and say we acknowledge our role in climate, but we also proactively want to lead this global energy transition, and that to see such important names like Chevron, like Greentown, like the Greater Houston Partnership, like Bobby Tudor's speech, like it's great. And it is bold that the mayor steps up and says this, but to see that commitment echoed from our partners shows that it's not just possible, but it's happening. And I am so inspired that when you also think that this happened in 2020, right? We have the most unprecedented challenge, new challenges every day, every week, that under normal circumstances, you could understand that things might slow down. And instead, we are speeding up, right? We are doing more and more. And that is inspiring to me. And, we have big, bold goals that we want to do here in Houston. But the fact that the community, that the energy industry, that global investors, that youth, that everyone seems to really be coming together, saying this is a global challenge, but Houston is a global leader. And that we really want to get hands-on and tackle this and keep Houston in that leadership role. And that also, I think Barbara talked about collaboration, but that it's not anything any one entity can do. That in the city, when our climate action plan, we look at the challenge of reducing our emissions here on the ground, just like every city is trying to do. We want to do our part. But the municipal operations are only a pretty small part of that. We're about 6% of the total community. And so if we do everything we possibly can, everything the mayor and all of the departments do, there's a big role for everyone else to play. But then also, as that Houston as the global energy capital of the world, if the companies that are here, like Chevron, if all of the folks at the Partnership and Center for Houston's Future work with, if all of the fabulous companies that Emily is going to bring to Houston, if they all do their part, Houston has an incredible promise of helping reduce emissions all over the planet. So much has happened in the past year, in the past 3 years. I'm cautiously optimistic about what it's going to look like going forward.
Very cool. So Chris, you're working specifically on EVs, and I guess this started about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. I remember going to a breakfast. I think it was at the Hotel Zaza, and about 150, 200 people in the room with the mayor to kick off this idea. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. To kind of tell us how it's gone. Where has this evolved literally since you've been engaged in this effort?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me here. You're right, that meeting had about 150 people, and I think that it surprised quite a bit in attendance. And, as I tell the story of how Evolve came to be, most people are surprised that there were that many people interested in talking about electric vehicles. in Houston, formerly oil and gas capital of the world. And so, where we've gone or where we've arrived today is we have an unprecedented partnership between the city of Houston. It's a public-private partnership between the city of Houston, CenterPoint Energy, University of Houston, Shell, and NRG. And essentially we're focusing on improving regional air quality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, squarely in line with the climate action plan that Lara has been working on and delivered. And oh, there go my lights. It's exciting. I mean, I think that without going into too deep of a dive of a pitch or an overview of Evolve, I mean, I just want to talk about the exciting opportunity that Houston has in front of it. 47% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector, and that's a significant amount. And people say, well, why should Houston care about EVs? Well, I think it's pretty simple. EVs are not only going to help improve our regional air quality, which has associated health outcomes with it, but frankly, EVs are fun to drive. And talking about innovation, I've seen some pretty unique innovations just personally. My wife and I just bought a plug-in hybrid minivan. And so when you start seeing those types of innovations, take hold of the family vehicle, I think we know that we're on the right path. And with Greentown Labs coming to Houston, I see some pretty exciting futures for us. I actually worked with Greentown Labs and Mark Vasu many years ago, right at the end of the first clean tech bubble. And I've seen firsthand how impressive, the companies that come from their cohorts are. And Houston could not be happier to have them here. And, Lara, you did say that maybe Houston, the city of Houston's, emissions overall are not that significant, but I think they are. And, I want to highlight that the city specifically, Lara and her team and the mayor are leading in ways that are quite unprecedented. For example, they put out an RFI for electric vehicle charging that frankly no other city in the state of Texas has done. And they received overwhelming amounts of responses from business leaders, the large businesses like the ones that are on this call, all the way down to individuals. And I think what's really exciting is that they're taking that information on electric vehicle charging, and they're taking very clear action to prepare for the future. The future is coming, and I couldn't be more excited. So I'll stop there, but I think that covers it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good. Well, I think 5 very distinct but interrelated perspectives. So appreciate all of you kind of talking about how far we've come. And if I just reflect back to where we were a year ago, we really have come quite a distance in a very short period of time. One of the things that we saw, as an organization is the need for that vision, and you guys are starting to provide that. But we wanted to kind of drill a level down. And this morning, we released a piece of work that we've been working on with the University of Houston, which just identified at least 4 areas which we think are really central to not only the challenge of decarbonizing the Houston region, but are really growth opportunities for Houston. Those were carbon capture, hydrogen, low carbon grid. So Chris, it sort of fits in with the idea of our electric demand growing and EVs, and how do we meet that through renewables, energy storage. And we had a really interesting presentation there that says we can get to 80%, maybe just using our market. And then finally on plastics recycling. So, those are at least 4 areas, and there are many others. I think the chart that Cindy showed indicated that those are maybe just a segment of other opportunities in the Houston region. So I'd like to give you guys just a chance maybe to to reflect on those 4 areas, or talk about what you guys see as really what Houston's opportunity set looks like. That's really what we're focused on today in this part of the conference. What is Houston's opportunity set to be a leader in the energy transition? So who'd like to start that conversation?
Well, Brett, I'll take a stab at that, and I'll try to weave in innovation, but also a little bit of, how Chevron thinks about this energy transition, because I think it's informative on the role Houston can play. So, we think about it in three ways. And the first one is, there's an existing business, and the carbon intensity of it needs to be lowered. Oil and gas plays a role in the energy system today, and it will going forward, but it needs to be decarbonized. So you mentioned CCUS. There are other ways to decarbonize it. Some of them, the technology is here, and it's just a matter of executing. Some of it is technology development. So it's sort of like getting the base business right. And I think getting everyone in Houston, the parties, to understand they've got a role to play in their business and with their carbon footprint. The second one, second area for us, and again, I think there's a Houston angle to this, is incorporating renewables into our business. And that really goes to the fact that this is an energy system, and the more you can think about the diversity of fuel sources or energy sources coming together, is important. So whether it is biomass into your products, or it is renewables into your operation to power your operation, I think that Houston can play a big role there. And Houston has both, I think, on the product side and on the power side, an opportunity to have a leadership role. And the third area is there's technology development and scaling of that technology that's needed for the energy transition. So not everything's done today. And you mentioned carbon capture, you mentioned hydrogen. The technology that is economic and has scaled is not there. And so, we believe we need to support technology development there, and then we need to scale. And so I think we as companies that have backed technology have a role to play. And then I think as a city, and as a region, there's opportunities to participate in that scaling. And scaling would play on a lot of the strengths of Houston, from an engineering perspective, across the value chain and all those disciplines, but also the financial side, because clearly different forms of capital and many forms of capital will be needed to do the energy transition at scale. And at scale is a really important part of the conversation.
Cool. So the two things I heard you said are development and scale. And those are issues that I think, others on your colleagues might want to comment on. Certainly there's a policy aspect of that Bob might want to comment on. And there's the development aspect of something Emily might want to comment on. And then how we get this deployed might be something that Chris or Lara might want to comment on. So who wants to jump in? Who wants to jump in next?
I'll just say briefly, Brett, that
ahead,
on the policy side, that we have an upcoming legislative session in Texas early next year, and really Texas hasn't developed the policy framework for all aspects of CCUS. Other states and some other states have, so it's very important that the industry speak in a loud voice, that we support the policy changes that will allow CCUS to move forward, to allow the infrastructure to be developed, the underground storage, the primacy, who's going to regulate this in Texas, is the state or the federal government. So a lot of issues need to be addressed quickly, frankly, for that not to be an impediment for the other efforts in Houston that are around technology and investment capital. The other thing we're doing at the partnership is talking to some of the sources of capital that have traditionally supported fossil energy and saying, how can you transition? Can you get comfortable? So the private equity community has played a major role for the last 4 or 5 years in financing the upstream. That they're much less inclined to do that going forward, given the poor returns they've seen, given the overall atmosphere for fossil investment. How do we shift those capital dollars at the appropriate time into this new space? We can't just rely on the operating cash flow of the energy companies, particularly in today's lower priced environment. We need to attract outside capital, but it's going to be an evolution to get people comfortable with the investments, the returns, the risk profile. But it's a conversation we're beginning to have. We couldn't have that conversation a year or a year and a half ago. There was just no interest. Today, they very much come to the table for the conversation.
Good. Jump in here, Emily.
Sure, happy to. And I would like to pick up on something that Bob said in his opening remarks, which is that he said solar and wind businesses and energy storage businesses in Houston, there are already 200 of them. And I think it's important to know that Houston is already successfully growing business, growing the economy in the area of decarbonizing the power sector. And so that's something outside of the topics that have maybe been mentioned this morning in terms of particular technology sectors, but renewables, you're already there. It's already moving forward, and it's just really exciting to see. Oh, I think all the areas that were mentioned this morning, carbon capture, hydrogen, circular economy, are very important areas for innovation going forward. And I think that, to Barbara's point, Houston is really uniquely positioned to be at the forefront of driving these critical pieces of the energy transition. And I think uniquely, Houston has the engineering expertise and experience doing energy at scale, which is what Barbara was mentioning. And, frankly, we need that set of expertise at the table, meaning those who have been in large companies in the energy industry to be able to decarbonize our economy as quickly as possible. And these are really gigaton-sized problems, and we need players who know how to achieve gigaton-sized solutions at the table. In terms of the innovation side, we're absolutely seeking startups in these areas, and we've worked specifically around hydrogen in the transportation context in a recent program with Shell and Toyota, where we sought innovations for the adoption of hydrogen infrastructure and supply chain technologies through cost reliability and new capabilities. And we expect to run another hydrogen program seeking more startups in this area in 2021. And of course, there will be a Houston component to that. In terms of carbon capture and reuse, we are going to be launching an RFP looking for startups that are developing valuable products from captured carbon, which we call carbon to value. And we are very bullish on this potentially $1 trillion market. So what do you do with the carbon once it's captured? Well, that's commercialization of carbon tech that we're looking at, really technologies that capture and convert carbon dioxide into valuable products or services. And we are hoping to engage with industry partners really all over the world, but especially in Houston as we move forward with this particular industry. And startups in these areas are definitely going to be coming from this area going forward, because this is where the talent is, the engineering expertise, and the ability to solve big problems lives.
Great. Well, Laura, this must make you feel good, because you've always been looking for help on implementing the climate action plan. So here's all the people who are going to help you.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I know is a theme throughout all of this is partnership. And Bob mentioned the legislature that's coming up, and that, Houston is unique. We are in Texas. The state doesn't have a lot of rules around some of the things that we are talking about. And so the city really has to lead. And that's such a good thing, because what you're seeing are sometimes unlikely partners coming together saying we have a mutual goal, and there's not a state rule and there's not a federal rule. So we're going to figure out a solution that fits for our unique system, our unique, diverse culture that we have here. And what we found is that with that kind of buy-in, with that diversity, oftentimes you come up with a really great solution that works for everyone. And so Evolve is such a great example of a partnership, a collaboration on electric vehicles. But we bring in Centerpoint Energy, we bring in Shell, an oil and gas company, NRG, a power company, the University of Houston, and the City of Houston, that we're all working together and saying we have different reasons, we're coming from different mindsets, but we have one goal because we want to see it move the city forward. And that's one example. The Climate Action Plan has hundreds of areas where we need that similar combination of mindsets to say, how do we tackle a problem and create a solution that really fits Houston.
Cool. So Chris, Lara teed you up there. You guys are an example of this kind of collaborative model. Talk a little bit about that and what some of your plans are.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Lara. Lara is very active and involved, and she does incredible work with us. You know, we have a pretty specific and clearly defined goal for the organization, and I think that a really good goal allows you to stay focused and, you know, ultimately win or achieve what you're trying to achieve. And so, you know, I'll start off by saying we have what sounds like a very audacious goal, but we'd like to see 30% of new vehicle sales be electric vehicles by 2030. And so, you know, many people ask, where are we? Well, we're just under 2%. You know, we've nearly doubled EV sales over the last year, even through a pandemic, which is pretty exciting. You know, I'm bullish. I think we'll get there much sooner, you know, than 2030. But time will tell. Will tell. In terms of, you know, how Houston, I think, can lead specifically around this, I think Houston has to take a unique approach. I mean, having city leadership is incredibly important. The public-private partnership model that we've put out there is second to none. But I also think the way that we focus and achieve our goals is fairly unique. So we look at addressing affordability, availability, and awareness. And that's how all of our activities are kind of geared. So affordability makes perfect sense. While EVs, frankly, once you own them, are cheaper to own, they'll last longer, and they retain their resale value. Availability is really tough. Just frankly speaking, most of the time, vehicles that are routed to Texas get rerouted to California. And I think that has a lot to do with, you know, how we've, I guess, historically been set up from a policy perspective. I think there's a huge opportunity to innovate around policies and incentives. I know that some local leadership is you know, taking active roles in that, and we plan to, you know, hopefully inform and be a really good resource for those who are conducting those types of activities. I will say, you know, a unique way that we are approaching this challenge of 30 by 30 is actually looking at the light duty passenger truck segment. You know, we're in Texas. Emily, you're not here, but when you are here, I assume you see tons of trucks on the road all over the place. Everybody on my street owns a truck, it seems like. And I think many of the OEMs are seeing that this is a real important segment. So 50% of vehicle miles traveled in the Houston region come from light duty passenger trucks. Beyond that, you know, I think Ford alone sold 900,000 trucks last year, right? It makes up 70% of their business. Roughly, if you look at the market across the board, we've got 10 new electric trucks coming on board, and it's probably as a result of, you know, some of these statistics. People in Texas and in Houston just drive more trucks, and I think they want to continue to drive more trucks. And I think Tesla, you know, relocating down to Austin to build their Cybertruck and the heavy duty vehicles is a really great indicator that Texas is a good place to do business. And, you know, I hope that we as a city can, you know, leverage some of that talent that y'all have referenced. We have more chemical engineers than anybody. We have very applicable talents across the board, from medical industry to oil and gas, that would be well served in the automotive, battery industry, you know, respectively. And not to mention, Houston is just very important and significant because of our relation to the port. And so, you know, whether it's looking at hydrogen trucking for long haul, or simply looking at reducing logistics costs for manufacturing and assembly, Houston has everything to offer. And I think that Greentown Labs coming here is a signal to the marketplace, and hopefully will be a signal to, you know, the rest of the industry that Houston is, you know, taking this very seriously.
Okay, so we're out of time, really, but I have one question that our friend Neil Golightly put into the chat. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask it, because it really tees up what we're going to talk about next week. And that's kind of this idea that there's a mismatch between all this great innovation we've been talking about and what kind of investor expectations are, right? Energy is not software. It takes a lot of time and requires a lot of money. And VCs usually want their money back, to dole it out in small increments, and they want to dole it out, and get it back fast. So there's a mismatch between this, and we're going to talk more about this next week. So how do we solve, how do we chop through this Gordian knot here, and what role can Houston play in making this innovation model work that hasn't really worked anywhere else? I know we're not going to answer this fully, but just get some quick thoughts on this idea. Who wants to maybe chime in on this one before we have to go?
Well, just a quick thought, Brett. One is the involvement of the corporate community, the customer base, to somewhat de-risk some of this technology sooner. I think investors are much more anxious or willing to invest if they have a clear signal from the corporates that this technology is moving into an area that the corporates are seeking. And we didn't have that connection, if you will, between the startup community and the corporate community a couple of years ago. So it was very difficult to kind of bridge that chasm, that risk and uncertainty. The things that Barbara and others are doing is not changing the fundamental character, because you're right, these energy technology improvements are longer lead time than your typical digital startup. But there are steps we can take to somewhat reduce the risk or make the risks more transparent throughout.
Good.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think that it's not totally correct to say that the VC has not gotten involved in clean tech in the past. They have, and they didn't do it in a very smart way. And so they have learned their lesson. And now I think that we've got the folks that are coming back in who are VCs are a lot smarter. The startups who they are investing in are a lot scrappier, and they understand resource efficiency. And that's an important part of the model going forward. But there's also a lot of other sources of capital that make up the early stages of the journey of the startup, supporting those stages. So I'd say if Houston could do anything about this, it would be to bring the entrepreneurial spirit that exists here and help us find, this is a city that knows how to finance big projects and things at scale. What are new models? Venture capital may not be a fit. If you need to get your money out in 3 to 5 years, probably not a fit. If you can wait 10 years, then you can have some patient capital. Those are kind of the new thinking, the new models that we need. So I look forward to working with folks in the finance community and across the board on identifying new models for financing the energy transition.